Hello everyone, welcome to Software Testing Expert Talk series. Today we have a guest who has close to 12 years of experience in software development and testing in the IT industry so far. Plus, he is handling a role of developer advocate at one of the prestigious organizations across the world. He is a front-end engineer and UX designer that's passionate about tackling challenges that can make the world a better place. He helps others learn by doing through articles, videos, and courses about JavaScript, React, and the static web through his website, of which we will talk about during our Q&A session. Today, he has came on our STET session to talk and demonstrate how can we achieve test automation with GitHub Actions. So please join me in welcoming him. And our guest for today's session is Colby Fayock. Welcome to our show,
Hey,
Colby.
everybody. Thank you so much for having me. How's it going, everybody? Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and excited to talk about testing in GitHub Actions.
Guys, as I have told you already that Colby will take us through the test automation with GitHub Actions today. So let's learn directly from him. Over to you, Colby.
Perfect. So first, let me share my screen.
Please go ahead.
All right, you see it? Ready to go?
Yeah, I can see that.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we can automate all of the things, specifically all the code and testing things with GitHub Actions. So who am I? After my good introduction there, I appreciate that, but I'm Colby Fayock. I'm the one hugging BB-8 and 𝐀𝐿 over there. I work with the developer community as a developer advocate with Applitools. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the web by just Googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. So we're going to just jump right into it. As developers, we have a bunch of tasks that we have to deal with day to day, right? Particularly, we're going to talk about code tasks. So let's see what some of those might look like. First, there's linting. Linting basically tells you if you write sloppy code. But jokes aside, on a serious note, it can actually be really helpful for pinpointing syntax errors. It's also generally helpful for making all your code look the same, which makes it really easy for being able to read and work through, especially with teams. But the problem is, unless you're running a modern framework that runs it out of the box, you really have to remember to run that. Formatting is another thing that's basically like linting, but it will fix all those linting issues for you. Your linter might even do it itself. But with formatting, you have tools like Prettier, where they will format the code and even include an opinionated configuration. Linting and formatting come with a lot of super practical benefits, but you also benefit from not having to spend time in code reviews arguing over syntax preferences. You can let the robots be the bad cop and do it for you. There's less that you have to think about and less that you have to stress about. But again, your worst enemy here is remembering to actually run it. Even more critical to a developer's workflow is testing, as we all know. And while formatting and linting help prevent errors, it's more so on the static analysis side. It helps you find the syntax errors, but it's not doing a lot to test the actual functionality. Tests, of course, help make sure that you don't break things and end up losing money when your online store is down. And these tests aren't just for all you Q&A engineers out there to run every once in a while. You need tests to be ran regularly. Otherwise, they're not doing their job. And finally, the last thing that we'll talk about is deployments. Ultimately, you want your application to go somewhere and end up being tested. You want people to actually use your application. But deployments can be painful. For large, complex infrastructures, there are a lot of moving pieces. And on top of this, you have to remember to deploy all those pieces. Missing one step could take the entire site down in a bad way. And not just because you're deploying a new version and have a little downtime between migrations. But a theme through all these tasks, as you might have noticed, is they're all important in one way or another. They help us focus on real challenges of our work, not drama in the code review or stumbling through another code deploy. But there's another thing. They all require humans to do them. That means they're prone to human error. And whether it's simply forgetting to run something or forgetting to include a particular step, even forgetting to do it in the right order, what can we do to avoid those human mistakes? Well, we can automate it, of course. So let's automate all the things. But how do we actually automate all of the things? Well, if we're deploying anything even moderately moderately complex, we have a bunch of things we typically have to do in order to deploy our full stack. Those 10 commands or buttons that you run every time you deploy your Rails server and AWS infrastructure, we can put that in a script. Scripts are probably the simplest form of automation. This helps us to automate the manual tasks that we might have to take. So why not put them in a bash script or insert your favorite scripting language of choice? You can even write your JavaScript in Node if that's your thing. The goal is to have a list of repeatable steps. And by using that one command with one script, you're able to do that exact same thing every single time. That way you never forget to do anything. But scripts, again, ultimately rely on something to trigger that. If it's still a human, you still might forget to run the script in the first place. Or if somebody is filling in for the day, maybe they won't even know that you have a script to run. A feature that comes baked in right to Git Hooks itself, or Git, is Git Hooks. You can trigger something at different points in the Git process. For instance, you can set up a Git commit hook where you can, anytime you make a commit, your hook will run, automating some part of that process, where a good example of that is formatting. Anytime somebody commits, you can set up Prettier or any other formatter to run before the commit actually applies. This is called pre-commit. Once that finishes, those changes are going to get added to the Git stage before the commit is applied. So when the actual commit actually happens, all Git knows is that it has this pretty formatted code, and all the developer knows is they got their job done. And when the code is pushed up to GitHub or your favorite Git provider, it looks like a single person wrote it. But not every single thing makes sense as a Git hook. You probably don't want to run your huge batch of Cypress tests as a pre-commit hook. That's going to be a huge pain for developers. Imagine you're working on a project with a huge test suite, and in order to actually commit, you have to run that entire thing. Nope, 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 nope. So we can take that up another level by running CI/CD processes. CI is continuous integration, and CD is continuous deployment or delivery, depending on who you ask. While some teams still require these to be kicked off manually, that kind of defeats the purpose, where the goal of CI/CD is to be automated within your code process. For instance, if you push a change to your main branch, that triggers a certain set of functionality. If you push a change to a feature branch or a branch off that default branch, that might trigger it a little bit differently. Some popular frameworks for writing these processes are Jenkins, Bamboo, Circle CI, and Travis CI. Depending on the framework, setup might look a little bit different. Most of them depend on some kind of configuration, but can have varying levels of scripting including. While this here is a simple example, I personally still have nightmares from working in Jenkins in past jobs, but I'm also primarily a front-end engineer. The DevOps team swore by it, but I think it's mostly because of the flexibility, not necessarily the ease of it. But setting up CI/CD can be super powerful. You don't have to try to memorize this slide here, but you can have a large, complex orchestration of your entire infrastructure. Need to deploy some Lambdas or dump a static site into storage? Add it to your CI/CD process. Need to spin up a VPC with really strict networking rules? Make Jenkins do it for you. And if you want to add testing on top of all that, all you have to do is add it as part of that deploy script, because you're really leveraging scripting and the automation of scripting. So you should really be able to accomplish anything you want. But like I mentioned before, I'm a front-end engineer and I struggled with Jenkins. It didn't have great documentation, at least at the time that I was working with it, and waiting for builds to finish took forever. For a lot of those frameworks, you also have to maintain servers. And did I mention that I'm a front-end engineer? I can spin up a node server, but I don't want to deal with servers. Servers are so last decade, am I right? Kidding aside, I want something where I can easily plug and play, something close to the rest of my code that I don't have to fight with. And after all that buildup, that's where the GitHub Actions come in. GitHub Actions are still technically CI/CD, but in practice, they feel so much more approachable. The best part is they can be just as flexible. With Actions, you start off by setting up an environment you want to run on in a workflow file. You add whatever commands you want to run, and when you want to run them, and you're off. For instance, if I wanted to simply run some tests, I can set up a test file to run on Ubuntu. I can check out that code, set up Node, install the dependencies, and run my tests. This alone will run my tests anytime a change is pushed. or if a pull request is created. As they run, they show up right in line with the rest of the pull requests, letting you know just by a really quick look if that proposed change actually broke things or not. This helps set up a great feedback loop for developers, where if something isn't working, they'll get that feedback immediately. I could also use GitHub Actions to deploy my code. Once I install my project dependencies, I can build that project and configure my AWS credentials as secrets. I can then sync those artifacts up to AWS to deploy. The AWS CLI is actually available by default, which makes this really nice and easy to do. And this really includes any kind of commands with the AWS CLI. Or I can even use actions from the marketplace. Like if I wanted to post a message to Slack when a new pull request is made, I can use the post to Slack action, which I can configure my project to send a note right in Slack. It's a helpful way to automate the little parts of the development workflow. These last few were some simpler examples, but it just goes to show with a few lines, we can really do a lot of things. The cool thing though, is we can even take this up another level and we can create our own GitHub Actions. Once you create a custom GitHub action, you really gain the flexibility to do whatever you want inside of that controlled environment. You have a few different options like running JavaScript with Node, or you can use Docker, where you really get the ability to do whatever you want. For instance, if I have a common task that includes a bunch of complicated things, I might not want to have to copy and paste that code between every single one of my repositories. I can set up that as a Node script and that script up as a new action. That way, I only have to make that one reference between all the different projects. And that's exactly what I did with my Applitools 𝐰𝐢𝐭𝐡 GitHub action. Just to add some context up here, if you're not familiar with Applitools, it's a visual testing platform where every time you run a test, 𝐰𝐲 takes a screenshot of your website or mobile application and compares those images with AI. To do that, Applitools has a ton of SDKs. So whether it's Cypress like you see here, or Selenium Java, or really any popular testing framework that will allow you to actually drop it in right into your existing tests. This is already pretty easy to do, but I wanted to make it even easier. I wanted a solution where someone who might not even have any testing set up could easily drop it in with some automated visual testing, which is where we come back to the Applitools 𝐰𝐲𝐿 GitHub action. Let me enhance this. This action just takes this one snippet. You have to plug in your API key, which is required anytime you want to run a test with Applitools, so that it can actually be attributed to your actual account and you can see all your results. And then you just provide the URL that you want to test with. Once that action starts off, it kicks off a process where it'll first crawl the URL that you pass in. It does a similar process to what you might expect Google to do with all of its robots for search, where it'll click around the site, it'll track what links are available for your site, and puts it all in a list. And you could even pass in your own custom sitemap URL if that's what you would prefer to do. But to crawl, I use an interesting package called Sitemap Generator, where I can run a simple command and have that entire list of URLs. And after I have my list, I can pass those URLs as an array right into Cypress, which I can run right inside of my script. And where finally Cypress will run those tests as it normally would, giving me my test runner and my results for the 𝐰𝐲𝐿 check. With those results, I can finally put them and comment them right on the pull request, whether it's passed, failed, or unresolved, giving the maintainer of the project an easy way to know if the code introduced a bug, or at a minimum, if it introduced a breaking change. I even figured out a solution where we can plug into an existing Netlify workflow. If you're not familiar with Netlify, just a quick aside, they'll automatically deploy your static application right from GitHub or a few other providers. This happens anytime you have changes that are pushed up to your default branch. So I was able to find an action where it actually waited for that deploy to finish. It stored that URL as output, and I passed it right into my GitHub action, which did its thing where it crawled the site and performed all the visual testing. But the entire project is ultimately a script that I need to run, where running it between projects is just a few input parameters of a difference, making it easy to add Applitools 𝐰𝐲𝐿 visual testing to any project. But let's also check out a few other examples of GitHub Actions out in the wild. I also created a GitHub Action template called Content Reminder. One thing I struggle with as a content creator for educational content is simply remembering to share all of my old content. So I put on my developer hat and I did something about it. I built content reminder as a GitHub action, where it's, again, simply a node script. But what happens is I run it on a cron so it triggers every 2 times a day. With GitHub Actions, in addition to Git events, we can actually run it on that same cron syntax that we're used to with other jobs. But then I look through a few RSS feeds of my content, find a random entry, and send myself an email with that content, pushing me to share it out to the world. Brian Douglas, who works at GitHub as a developer advocate, particularly working with actions, likes to create very focused actions based on his work with the community, as well as his actual community open source. Like here, where he listens to comments on GitHub issues and provides an invite mechanism for a GitHub team. He hooks into the GitHub ecosystem using 𝐓𝐞𝐬𝐭, particularly here Ruby flavored, and runs a Ruby script to handle all that logic. It can even check if somebody's trying to add themselves, which, depending on the hackathon, might not be permitted. And performance testing is also one of the things that should be on top of everybody's mind when building applications for the web. Lighthouse is a fantastic tool from Google that helps measure that performance. The Lighthouse CI Action lets us drop those measurements right into our GitHub projects. Not too different from my actual Applitools action, but we can pass that URL right into the Lighthouse CI action, and we can also define a performance budget, such as max page size. When Lighthouse runs, it'll take that budget into consideration, and if it finds any issues, it'll add the annotations right inside of GitHub, letting us know what those issues are. But whatever you do with actions, the goal is to automate as much of your code tasks as you can. Again, let the robots do the hard work and be the bad cop. Spend your time on the unique challenges of the projects and finding new things to test to make sure you're covered in your application. The great thing about actions, though, is that it makes it approachable for anybody to use. I no longer get stressed out when I'm working with CI/CD workflows. I love setting up a new action and figuring out what I can automate. I get excited seeing something I run automatically that I no longer have to do, and I'm sure you will too. So to actually take a look at this, let's do a real quick demo where I'm going to show you how to run some existing tests right inside as a GitHub action. So I'm going to first swap my screen to share my actual desktop. Let's find it here. Cool. So right now you should see this repository that I have called My Next Jest. And really all this repository is a code demo that I created for one of my tutorials, where let me open this up inside of my code editor. We can see that what this is doing inside is it's actually going through and it's running these tests based on an API and a lib that I created as part of the example that I set up for Jest. So in this instance, it's running this test that's returning the calculated subtotal for items. And it's going to go through, it's going to pass in these items and make sure that the calculation is actually coming out as expected. So it's a pretty basic test, but it's just simply to show how this kind of thing works. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this test. And first of all, let's prove that it runs. So I'm pretty sure I installed the dependencies and we can see as yarn jest runs, it's actually running them. But I'm going to create a new repository so I don't mess this one up here because we're going to break it after too. But let me first clone this down, git clone, STET Actions. And I'm also going to create this as a new repository because we're going to create those actions right inside of GitHub. So I'm going to create my new repository. And then finally, I'm going to initialize Git on that so that I can actually initialize it. And then I'm going to set that up as my remote and push it out so that we now have our new project. But again, let me just run yarn install and actually run the test just again to prove that the tests are working in our local environment, because that's important, right? I want to make sure that it's actually, and I read yes, that doesn't make sense, but we want to make sure that we're actually starting from a correct spot, right? Okay, so we see that these tests are running and they're working, but what we want to do is we want to be able to get these tests to run inside of a GitHub action. We don't want our developers, well, they should be, but we don't want our developers to every single time have to run yarn test, or at least if they forget to, we want to make sure it still always automatically runs. So we're going to set this up inside of the UI inside of GitHub just to kind of show the very basic workflow of how we can actually get this up and running. So over here on the Actions tab, they actually give you a few different examples for where you can get started with. And for my instance, I'm working with a node project. So I'm going to just click this setup simple, this workflow. And we can see that it starts off with this blank .yaml file where I'm going to call this my tests. And we can start going through this syntax where this is going to be a YAML file that defines the configuration of our actual workflow file. Now, I'm going to get rid of some of these comments because I'm going to explain to you myself, and it just makes it a little bit busy for me to kind of show. But to start from the top, we have our name. That can be whatever we want. But then we have our triggering mechanism where we want to say we want it to trigger every time this happens. And in this instance, we can see that by default, GitHub's giving us these options where every time that we push a commit or we create a pull request to the main branch, it's going to trigger it. And we can also see this additional one, which gives us the ability to run manually, which I can show you later. But then is where we define our jobs. And this is really similar to a lot of the other CI/CD environments that you have access to, where we're going to configure what we want to do. So first of all, build is the name of what our current workflow is currently called. We can again call that test if we want, or really whatever we want to describe what's happening inside of the job. But then we define what we want it to run on. And in this instance, let's just leave it on Ubuntu because that's probably the most common one that the actions actually run on. And this works perfectly for our particular instance. But then once we have that basic configuration set up, we can actually start digging into what we want to run. Now, let me again get rid of these comments so I can walk you through it myself without it being too busy. But in this particular instance, which I'm going to remove, we can see that GitHub by default, it's going to first check out the code from the repository. So that means if we look back at the project, it's going to first pull all of this code down into a working directory so that we can then do whatever we want with it. So we want to keep that there. Now, again, in this instance, what they're going to be doing is they're going to simply echo hello world just to show that it's working, and then a multi-line script. So we want to actually do something in those scripts rather than just run some test code. So I'm going to first get rid of all that, and then I'm going to create my new step where the first one, let's call this install dependencies, because ultimately we need to have our dependencies installed to be able to run the test, right? So then I'll use the run property where I'll say yarn install. So next, once the dependencies are actually installed, I am successful and I want to actually run those tests. So I'm going to say a new step of name run tests. And then for my actual run property, I'm going to say yarn test, just like we did locally. And really, in this particular instance, that's all we have to do. Now, maybe sometimes your application needs to be built first before you actually run the test on it. So maybe if that's the case, you would do another one that has build and you have run where you run yarn build. But in my case, I don't actually have to build it before I run those tests. So I'm just going to leave this for our demo as is with that. But now I can commit that right into my repository where we can see that it got created inside the GitHub directory and then the workflows directory, where I now have this test.yaml file that we just created. So now that we have that created, we can head back over to the actions tab where we can already see that that new job was kicked off because we pushed that commit to the main branch. Now, when we open it up, we can see the UI that's going to tell us the description of that particular test. And now the reason why this looks like it can have more stuff on it is because you can have more complicated workflows that do a variety of things and a variety of steps. And it's one of the great ways that gives us flexibility. We can even see that it passed already, but we're going to dig right into it. But as soon as we click through, we can see exactly what's going on each step of the way, where some of this is just boilerplate GitHub Actions, but we can see that it's first going to check out the code for our particular repository. It's going to then install the dependencies, which is exactly what we wanted to do. And then it's going to run the tests, where just like we saw locally, we saw that it ran the tests and that it was successful. So yay, that's awesome. Now, this doesn't really help unless it's actually protecting against something, right? And in our case, we want the test to make sure we're giving that feedback in the event that something fails, such as a pull request that might break that functionality. So let's try to break a test and see what happens when it, well, breaks. So inside of the test, how about I'm going to mess up one of the orders endpoint. And instead of this very simple calculation where I'm saying I want the subtotal with the price multiplied by the quantity, I'm just going to take out the quantity so that it's not going to consider multiple items that are getting in there. It's just going to have that one price. So that theoretically should mess up the test, right? And hopefully that I'm right that it's going to. But I'm going to, instead of committing that right to the main branch, I'm going to create a pull request so we can see what that feedback actually looks like. So I'm going to not bother putting in the description for our time right now, but I'm going to go ahead and create that pull request. We can even see those file changes right on the side here. But if we go back to this conversation view, we can see we now have these checks that appear on our pull request, where we can see that same action that we created. It's now running as part of this pull request process. I can even click into the details of this, and I can see it's going through the same exact steps as it was before, where it's installing the dependencies now, and then it's next going to run those tests as soon as those dependencies are met, which it looks like the dependencies are just finishing up now, so we can see what that looks like. But ultimately, that's going to be able to give us our feedback. And as we expected, we can see that the test started to fail. We get that big red X, which is what we want because we want to make sure we tell developers when something is broken. But if we head back over to that conversation view, we can now see that all checks failed. And that means we can't actually, well, in this instance, we can move forward because I'm the owner of it, but we have that check there saying that it failed. And I actually got an email just now saying that it failed. Now, with permissions set up properly, you can even prevent the pull requests from getting merged if the checks are getting failed, which is important if you're trying to make sure that you have a critical workflow going on that's going to protect against bugs actually going out into the wild. But we can see with just a few lines there and a real simple workflow setup, we were able to get those tests running. And again, they're simple tests for our particular demo, but being able to run all those tests, no matter how many are in there, we're able to do by just this simple workflow file, which makes GitHub Actions super approachable for anybody that wants to jump in and actually work with it and having those checked in right next to the code. So now I'm going to switch back over to my slides just to wrap up. All right, there we go. So I hope that was helpful in kind of seeing actually firsthand what it's like to create a new GitHub action. As I mentioned before, I feel like they're very approachable in the way that somebody can jump right in and create an actual workflow file. And this can be as complex as you want. You know, you can put your entire infrastructure or testing system right in there. It's just you have so many opportunities where you have that dedicated environment to run it outside of an individual workflow, and they manage all the servers for you, and you don't really have to think beyond making sure that your tests are running the way you want. Now, if you want to learn more about creating your own GitHub action, or if you want a quick walkthrough example, I have a ton of resources, including an egghead course and a ton of YouTube videos on GitHub Actions. And as well, if you want to learn how to go from end to end from the design all the way up to a full stack Next.js application, including setting up the tests, particularly with Applitools, to run a storybook component library, then you can check out my free course on YouTube, where you can find it at fromdesign2.dev. And thank you, AJ. Thank you for having me on here. And I'm excited to answer some Q&A questions and, chatting more about what we talked about today. But generally, if you want to find me anywhere, I'm at Colby Fayock, and the links and resources from my talk you can find at colbyfayock.com/STET.
Awesome, Colby. That was, very energetic session. And again, I have learned a lot while going through it.
Awesome.
Coming to Q&A session now. Okay. So I have few set of questions which I will definitely ask you. And so starting with my first question. So we all were knowing about GitHub from long back. Then how this GitHub Actions has came into picture now?
Yeah. So I think GitHub is really interesting because, they're not only just trying to solve your issues about storing your code, they're trying to help solve the issues that revolve around that process, things that happen from a developer workflow perspective. If you're familiar, they also had a program where they were trying to have their own package management system. And, I don't think that really took off as much as they were hoping for, but now you see things like they have a code editor that they open up where I think it's actually VS Code that they can open up right for your code inside of your repository. So I feel like what they're ultimately trying to do is figuring out how to resolve the issues and make workflows easier for teams that are trying to build projects. And one of those is CI/CD and generally trying to run those processes. So GitHub Actions kind of just makes sense in that perspective, right? Where it's a pain point that makes really a lot of sense since it should be so close to your code, where you can run those processes right on their servers and it incorporates itself right into the development workflow.
Right. That's true. That's really true. Okay. Coming to next question. Okay. So what we can achieve using GitHub Actions?
So what do you have in your imagination? Because I feel like you can achieve anything with GitHub Actions. And, I kind of say that with a smile on my face, but I feel like you have so much opportunity. And one of the things that I enjoy the most with my work is being creative with GitHub Actions, because of course you can do your typical developer workflow things like we discussed in the talk, where you can run your tests, you can deploy your code, you can run linting, like you can do all those code tasks, but there's so much more that you can do. Like my content reminder, where it sends me an email every time. And I'm actually working on a GitHub action right now where I have a newsletter and I want to sign up for the Twitter newsletter feature, but I need to be able to sync those, the people who want to sign up for my newsletter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a script every day that updates that syncs those newsletter signups so that I can take advantage of that. And I'm going to do that with a GitHub action where I can just set it up to run on a cron every day. So really, it's just whatever you can imagine. And another fun instance I thought is this one person, I forget the name, they actually created a working chess example on their profile based on GitHub Actions. And the way that it works is you click on a move, and when you click on that move, it opens up a new Git issue, which triggers a GitHub action. And that GitHub action will update the page with the move so that the chessboard actually moves. It's really creative. And it's just, like I said, there's so much that you can do. It's really up to your imagination and creativity for being able to solve these challenges with it.
Wow, that's an awesome answer. Great. Coming to next question, Bobby. So how many services does GitHub Actions support for code deployment?
So that's a great question. I feel like it can really support anything that can be programmatically installed. Now, I know that it does support a bunch kind of out of the box, like I was talking about AWS, where the CLI is readily available for you to use. But, most of the time with these services, you ultimately need to maybe spin up some kind of software, but as long as you can programmatically grab that software and spin it up in that environment, just like you would on any kind of other Docker workflow or controlled environment, you should be able to do the same thing with GitHub Actions. Now, of course, there's definitely some security restrictions with Actions because they ultimately don't want you doing compromising things on it, right? So there are going to be limits there. But again, like I think they're trying to support like really whatever service you want to run on it.
Okay, fine, got it. So coming to next question, Kobe. What are the suggested workflows provided by GitHub Action for your code repositories?
Sure. So I think probably like the most basic one is the one that we worked through today, right? Where it just simply runs your tests. I don't think there's necessarily like a suggested workflow because most of the times it's really catered to the team's development environment, right? Where testing is a very common part of that. So I think it's more about the suggestion is trying to find what tasks does your team do all the time that can be automated away, because that's the important thing. Be able to give that time back to the developers, the testers, and being able to give them that time and let the automation with GitHub Actions take care of it for you.
Okay, got it. Coming to next question, Kobe. What is code owners feature and what does it do in GitHub Action?
Sure. So code owners is a feature that allows you to specify who actually owns, and it's kind of in the name, right? It's who owns a particular set of code inside a repository. So for instance, if there was two sets of, if there was Ruby and JavaScript in the code base, and I'm the one who managed the JavaScript part of it, I would be the code owner of the JavaScript part, right? So what that does is on the repository, it sets up some automated processes, such as it'll automatically make me a reviewer anytime somebody tries to change code. And I know it does a lot more than that. I haven't actually used it before, but that's my general understanding. But however, I don't think it doesn't directly apply to GitHub Actions, where more so the pull request is part of the GitHub Action workflow, right? And code owners will be associated with that. So while it's like tangentially related, I don't think there's any code owner specific features of GitHub Actions, at least from what I've been able to find.
All right. Okay, coming to next question. What are webhooks in GitHub Actions?
Yeah. So one of the awesome parts about the GitHub Actions is you could hook into a bunch of different Git-based events, right? So the ones that we went through in the demo were the push and the pull request, where anytime I push a commit out to Git, it's going to run, or anytime I create a pull request, it's going to run. But those aren't the only type of events that people need in order to automate processes. And we even saw with the cron based syntax that that's another option. But what webhooks are going to allow you to do is hook into those events and external events where you can trigger those processes based off of REST requests, where you can trigger events inside of a GitHub repository and it'll actually go, it'll start to kick off the action as long as it correlates with that particular event.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Coming to next question, how can we go to logs file if something gets failed by running an automated test case?
Sure. So the log files are readily available right inside the action. So once you're inside of the action, you can click, or the pull request, you can click the details, or you can go to the actions tab and navigate to it that way. But you can click the details and it'll show you all the steps, kind of like we saw when we were looking at it inside of the project during that demo. Now, taking that a step further, you can even download that entire log file. For example, like maybe you don't want to use the UI, or maybe it's too long and you want to run some search on it, or whatever the case is, you can download that as a raw text file so that you can take all those logs and do something with them. So you really have a lot of options for how you can actually view the logs. Now, part of what I really like is when you can take the GitHub action and actually provide UI as part of that. Now, the Lighthouse CI, for instance, they'll add annotations to the actual repository if there's an issue, right? So that somebody doesn't have to go searching through the logs and actually find out what's wrong, where they have that option. But ideally, they can save their time and just see those notifications right inside of the pull request. Or like my Applitools action, where I actually comment on the pull request, giving you exactly what passed and what failed as part of the results of those tests.
Okay, got it. Okay, coming to next question. So if any person is new to GitHub Actions, then what are the ways to learn it and get started with it?
Sure. So if you have an example repository like I had there, and you can even use mine if you want, you can create a very basic test, kind of like we just did today. I think that's a really great way to just kind of like open up the door and see that it is easy to get started with the basic level of it. And then once you're there, you can start stacking up more features on top of that to get an understanding of what else you can do. Now, part of the thing that I enjoy is just being curious about what else I can do. So, it's as simple as taking a Google search and saying, how do I do this with GitHub Actions, right? Because a lot of the time somebody else tried to do the same thing, and likely you're going to be able to try to do the same thing as well. So whether it's that, or I know that GitHub has a lot of really great resources if you want to actually go step by step through it, or I have a lot of great videos. And as I mentioned, I have a course for custom GitHub Actions on egghead. There's fortunately a ton of great resources on it. I know Brian Douglas is a really great follow on Twitter. 𝐷ougieYo is his handle if you want more directly from the GitHub team. But there's luckily a lot of great ways to kind of get your foot in the door. And luckily they make it easy by running that first action in the actions tab inside of the repository.
Cool. Okay. So coming to the next question, and that would be our last question for this Q&A session. So just want to know, as you have been working collaboratively within the team to deliver world-class products, what do you think that skills should today's tester should carry with themselves?
Sure. So part of what I enjoy about kind of the testing world is that there really needs to be like a creativity involved in that, because the hope is that you can automate away a lot of the manual tasks, right? I totally am on board. I don't think there's ever going to be a case where we don't need manual testers actually trying to break things and poke around. But being able to automate as much of that away as we can gives us the ability to spend more time on the unique parts of it, right? So I think being able to have that kind of creative mindset and ways to actually be able to take the tools we have, while just continuing to push on it and develop new ways of automating those things is really important for testers, where using things like GitHub Actions, maybe we want to simply run the test like we showed today, or maybe you can use it to run health checks on your site. Because another important aspect is making sure the site's up and running, right? So maybe you can use a GitHub action that simply every day or every hour just pings a server to make sure that it gives a 200 response, right? So just coming up with creative solutions so that you can make sure that the application is healthy while you're able to focus on the more kind of unique parts of the system that you can't automate.
Got it. Got it. All right. Thanks, Colby. Finally, we have reached to closure of this. We have reached closure of this wonderful session presented by you on GitHub Actions, and it was simply superb. So, anything else you want to share before we wrap up this wonderful session?
Yeah, I just if you want to you feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more, or if you have any questions about this, and I'm also going to be answering the questions in the chat, but of course, you know, I'm enthusiastic about GitHub Actions. There's a lot of great things we could do with them. So my advice is to just go out there and try and do it. The worst case is the workflow breaks on your first run and it doesn't actually have any consequence. So try to learn how to use it, and, you know, let me know if you come up with any creative ways that helps you with your application.
So we also know that you also have a YouTube channel on your name. So could you just share it with us and just tell us what our audience can learn out of it from you?
Sure. Thank you for that shout out. So yeah, you can find me on youtube.com/Colby Fayock, where most of my content revolves around more front end oriented stuff. So I'm a big Next.js fan, if you're familiar with that world, where I get to create React applications and help people use tools as part of that. But I also like to explore other tools in the world. Like I have a Jest tutorial that I have, and I have a bunch of GitHub Actions tutorials on how you can automate away some of those processes. So if you're generally interested and curious about the web and the tools of it to help build and automate it, definitely check out my channel. I have a lot of great tutorials there, and I'd love to hear what you all think.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks, Colby, for joining us over STAT and sharing your knowledge based on your experience in your tenure in IT industry so far. Hope our audience would have learned a lot of things from your session, and we would be expecting more such deep dive sessions in upcoming days as well. We wish you all the best for upcoming projects on which you're working on, and thanks for being part of our STAT journey.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.